Hi, thank you so much for having me. So, this session is called Thriving and Flourishing, and I promise you that by the end of the talk, I will leave you with some optimistic thoughts. But before we get there, we have to talk about prejudice towards bisexuals. So, bisexuals experience two distinct social phenomena. On the one hand, bisexuals are an invisible sexual minority. That means that bisexuals are nearly absent from LGBTQ politics, from media representation, and even from research. At the same time, bisexuals are prejudiced against. Now, I'm going to focus on a very specific kind of prejudice: social stereotypes. Stereotypes are generalized and often negative beliefs about a social group. Now, the list about bisexual stereotypes is a bit long, but I'm going to focus on two. The first is that bisexuals are confused. In its extreme form, the belief goes that bisexuals are confused about their own sexual identity, that they're actually not even bisexual. They're either gay or heterosexual, but they don't know it. In its milder form, the belief goes that bisexuals are confused about whom they want to be with at the current moment, whether with men or with women, non-binary people. This leads us to the second stereotype, that bisexuals are promiscuous. And here the belief goes that bisexuals are never satisfied with any one partner, whether romantic or sexual, and therefore keep swapping partners from different genders and cannot stay in a monogamous relationship simply because they have no self-control. Now, the main question is, how can these two phenomena coexist? How can we have specific social stereotypes about bisexuality at the same time with invisibility? Put in another way, can a person who is unfamiliar with bisexuals have specific stereotypical beliefs about them? Now, from a social learning perspective, the answer should be no. From this perspective, stereotypes are learned through interactions, whether direct or indirect, with the social group. Therefore, a person who is unfamiliar with bisexuals should not have stereotypes about bisexuals. However, this perspective never felt correct from a personal experience. Before I started this study, I used to ask people, do you know what are the stereotypes towards bisexuals? And they would say, no, I didn't even know there were any stereotypes about bisexuals. Actually, you're the first bisexual person I ever met. But these people profess their own lack of familiarity about bisexuality. But at the same time, the same people would ask me, so are you in an open relationship? So even though they had no familiarity with bisexuality, they still held to the belief that bisexuals are inherently non-monogamous. So how can we bridge between these two things? So we came up with a theory we called stereotype deduction. According to this account, stereotypes about bisexuality are not learned, but are rather deduced based on gender binarism. So what do I mean by gender binarism? Gender binarism is the belief, or even the ideology, that gender is comprised of two distinct, dichotomous, and opposing categories of men and women. Now, I'll risk the saying that I think that us in this room, we don't think that gender is binary, and we think that gender binarism is false. But let's try to follow this line of reasoning. If men and women are opposite categories, that means that bisexuals are people who have two distinct opposite attractions. Now, what would we think about people who have opposite attractions? If you're drawn to one side, you're necessarily left out and missing out on being on the other side. So just from gender binarism, we can conclude that bisexuals should be inherently conflicted and confused. So the point of this study is to try to adjudicate between these two accounts, social learning versus stereotype deduction. The first step we had to do is to show that we can quantify social stereotypes towards bisexuals. Now, previous studies have done this using questionnaires that measure attitudes towards bisexuals as a group. However, because of public invisibility, in some of these studies, people would say, well, actually, I don't have attitudes towards bisexuals as a group. Therefore, we tried to evaluate social stereotypes toward a bisexual individual. So put yourself in the participant's shoes. You're entering a website, and please meet Sarah and Laura. So you're reading about their first date, and Sarah is going to ask Laura a series of questions. So some of the questions were innocuous. For example, she would ask, what's your favorite fast food, pizza? And then she would ask, are you a cat person or a dog person? Dog person. And then she would ask the critical question, do you ever find yourself attracted to men? And then participants got a different answer. One group of participants got an answer, no, never. Okay, and then Laura will be lesbian. And then the other group got, actually, yes, I'm bisexual. Okay, and then Laura will be bisexual. And then from there, we have to try to help Sarah by evaluating Laura's personality. So for example, we would answer questions like, Laura is extroverted, and we'll say whether we agree or disagree. Or items like anxious and easily upset, agree or disagree. And of course, the critical stereotype questions like whether Laura is indecisive and confused. And that allowed us to have a quantifying measure of how much people think of Laura in a stereotypical way. Now, of course, we could also manipulate the gender of the two characters. So, for example, half of the participants in the second study didn't get Sarah, they got James. And James would ask Laura, do you ever find yourself attracted to women? And again, either yes or no, affecting the sexual orientation. So we had two studies overall. The first evaluating perceptions about bisexual men, the second about bisexual women. Our evaluators were all heterosexuals. We didn't have enough participants of either other sexual orientations. And relative to non-bisexuals, the target characters that were bisexuals were perceived as promiscuous and confused, right, unsurprisingly. And from this point, the results diverged. So bisexual men were perceived as being untrustworthy and open-minded, while bisexual women were perceived as being emotionally unstable, unpleasant, extroverted, and undependable. So there's a notion that attitudes towards bisexual men are far more negative than attitudes towards bisexual women. And I want to say that this shows a rather more complicated picture. And I think this relates to the negative attitudes that society has towards female sexuality in general. Whereas a male sexuality is appreciated, female sexuality is really has negative attitudes related to it, for example, being emotionally unstable. So from this vantage point, we can go on and ask questions about these social stereotypes. But before we answer the main questions, I have to add one more theoretical concept called stereotype knowledge. So stereotype knowledge is just the knowledge that someone has about the social stereotypes. So not my personal belief, just my knowledge about other people's beliefs. And the way people measure stereotype knowledge is like this. People are asked just to mention in free form what are the stereotypes about a specific social group. So from that database, you can build a list of adjectives that reflect the social stereotypes. So let's say the definitive list of stereotypes toward bisexuals is these 4 adjectives. Now, of course, the list is longer, but just for the sake of it. And then participant 1 said that bisexuals are slutty, undecisive, and actually gay. So they mentioned 3 out of the 4 categories. They got a score of 75%. The second participant said that bisexuals are unfaithful, and for some reason said that they're unfashionable. So that's not in the list. That's not counted. It's 1 out of 4, 25%. And if a participant says that they don't know, they get 0. Okay, so why is stereotype knowledge so important? Because it will help us to distinguish between social learning theory and stereotype deduction. So from a social learning perspective, stereotype knowledge is merely an extension of familiarity with a social group. And therefore, people who have bisexual stereotype knowledge should be able to be stereotypical towards bisexuals. And people who don't have stereotype knowledge should not be able to be stereotypical. So there's supposed to be a positive correlation. On the other hand, stereotype deduction says that you don't need stereotype knowledge in order to be stereotypical. Thank you. In fact, but that doesn't mean that stereotype knowledge is not important, because stereotype knowledge allows us to have one more thing, which is self-control. So if I know that my own beliefs are actually prejudicial, stereotypical, I might do more to inhibit these inclinations. Whereas someone who has no idea that their own beliefs about bisexuals are actually prejudicial, why should they inhibit themselves? So for our perspective, there should actually be a negative correlation, and people who are less familiar should have more stereotypical evaluation. So in our first study, a subset of participants, they did not go through the main paradigm, rated their stereotype knowledge, gave their own, what they think the stereotype is. And on this axis, we have prejudice as measured by a questionnaire. This is a questionnaire about tolerance. And what we found is a negative correlation. Okay, so the more knowledgeable you are, the more tolerant you are, the less prejudicial you are. However, that's not exactly what we want to measure. We want to measure the actual stereotypical evaluation. So in the second study about bisexual women, this is a subset of the sample that you saw before. And again, we have stereotype knowledge on one axis. And now on the other axis, we have prejudice as measured as the mean evaluation towards the target character. And once again, we see a negative correlation. Okay, so the more stereotype knowledge someone has, the less likely they are to use it. And even people who have absolutely no stereotype knowledge could still use these stereotypes in evaluation. And just to make it clear, this is the first time that anyone used a stereotype knowledge paradigm to show a negative correlation. All other studies, either no correlation or a positive correlation. So this is actually somewhat unique. Okay, so let's try to conclude. What do we see here? First, we see that heterosexuals perceive bisexuals as promiscuous, as confused. That's not really surprising. We also see that other negative evaluations are dependent on gender, that bisexual men are perceived as being open-minded, while bisexual women, for example, are perceived as being unstable. Moreover, people who are unfamiliar with bisexual stereotypes are actually more likely to use these stereotypes in evaluation, actually more likely to be prejudicial. This attitude does not, this finding does not match the notion of social learning, suggesting that bisexual stereotypes are not learned. So we conclude that they're deduced, and from our perspective, deduced based on gender binarism. And now for a few optimistic points of view. The first is that given that familiarity actually reduced stereotypes, this means that we have a lot of room for education and representation to have an important impact of people's attitudes towards bisexuals. Given that there's a vacuum of public invisibility, the more we talk about bisexuality, the less prejudicial people would be about bisexuality. The second, that we think that this stereotype deduction view might be a useful perspective that can link between societal attitudes towards sexuality and gender in general to more specific prejudice towards sexual minorities. So for example, my intuition is stereotypes about asexuality, that asexuals are somehow immature, that asexuals are non-social, can relate to societal attitudes and values towards sexuality in general. And the last point is that these results suggest that our struggles for tolerance are intertwined, that if we are to fight against prejudice towards bisexuals, we are also fighting against the notion that gender is binary. And the more we teach people about the diversity of gender experience and gender identities, the more people will be tolerant towards bisexuals, just because of the connection between them. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alon. That was any questions? two women in a conversation. You mentioned that when she said that she liked men, and she was bisexual.
Yes.
When people, do you think that it had an impact, the fact that you said that she was bisexual instead of just saying that she liked men and women? Do you think that idea that is invoked by that word could be
Yeah, it absolutely could be, right? That people would say that a word on its own is an alarm system rather than what they think about attraction to multiple genders. So absolutely can't like distinct what will happen. But I think that that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to let people say, okay, this is how she self-identifies. Now what do you think of her? And then to see their evaluation.
Is there any research that shows that bisexuals are more likely to be less gender binary?
If I remember correctly, yes, though that's not my field, so I can't say with confidence. So I do, if I remember correctly, there is, and it does show that. Also that people who are gender non-binary are also more likely to be multisexual, bisexual, pansexual. Absolutely. Yes.
I'm sorry, I know you just said something. I have a question for you. Were you able to test whether the findings were moderated by race or ethnicity?
Mm-hmm.
And were you also able to test whether the findings changed if the characters in the experimental paradigm were different races and ethnicities?
So regarding the sample of evaluators, we didn't have a large sample of people of different ethnicities, but the sample that we did have, we could have kind of a rough test to see that there were no real significant differences in the correlations or in the evaluations. But regarding the second question, absolutely this test is limited because we presented all the evaluators with two white, heteronormative looking characters. And that was actually because we knew that attitudes towards like people of different ethnicities can also affect. So we really wanted to have like the best case scenario that people will be the least negative towards these characters and still see if there are differences. I really assume that if we'll manipulate both gender identity and race, we'll see even more extreme results.
I wonder what your thoughts are regarding the negative correlation between knowledge and prejudice. Do you think that's related to people just maybe knowing more bisexuals and having talked about this, or just even having that knowledge of stereotypes allows them to critically examine those stereotypes they want to think
Right.
about?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, and this is specifically because bisexuals are an invisible minority. I think that this correlation cannot be found once people are really aware about bisexuality. But in this current time, then only people who are familiar with bisexuals, that have met bisexuals, that have talked with bisexuals will know that these stereotypes are actually offensive. So then they'll try, oh, this is actually something I know about. I'm not going to use this stereotype just because I know that, for example, Laura is bisexual. That doesn't mean that she's confused. Right? So yeah, I think it's because people who are familiar. And on the other hand, people who are unfamiliar, they have absolutely no reason to avoid. Just like the people who told me, like asked me, yeah, that's not an offensive question because why would it be?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.